During the Gurdjieff book series that I made, there's a video in which Gurdjieff explains how there are many selves co-inhabiting us, and they each arise according to the occasion, so that we would be one self or have one active self when we are interacting with our kids, and we would have another active self when we're interacting with our coworkers, for example. And we would be one self at night, making a decision that we want to get up early in the morning, and we would be another self that doesn't want to get out of bed when the alarm goes off the next day. And one of the things that was interesting in that statement from Gurdjieff was that he said each of them wants to be caliph for an hour, meaning that each self considers itself to be the ruler or the king of the entire system. And what was interesting in that statement was both the fact that we are ruled by different impulses at different times, even during one day, but also the idea of rulership was very interesting to me. And in this video, I would like to make an analogy of how understanding political systems that are top-down versus those that are more democratic is a great analogy to understand what can happen with our minds when we do the work of self-cultivation. This channel is Meditation Amsterdam. My name is Pablo, and today I want to talk about how self-cultivation transforms your system away from a dictatorship towards more of a democratic system, and eventually more to a swarm intelligence, or a kind of, you could say like a murmuration of birds or a school of fish that is fully self-regulated. If we take political systems and we look at the dynamics of a top-down system, you would say that intelligence and power are highly centralized in a small group of individuals that are, through force, trying to control a large mass of individuals. And that large mass will very often, although not always, consist of individuals of a very low levels of education. There are exceptions to this, of course. I was speaking with an Iranian person the other day, and it was interesting to know that Iran has a very high level of education for everybody, and it is yet a dictatorship which is enforced through pure violence. But in many cases, the dictatorship co-arises out of the dynamics on the ground, because you have a fairly large mass of people who are not particularly well educated. And that creates a certain dynamic of, as I said, centralization of power, enforcement of that power, and a large mass of not particularly intelligent individuals, if education is an indication of that, of course, but also not particularly well informed. You would also characterize a dictatorship by very poor bottom-up communication. In other words, there's a lot of top-down enforcement of things, but people at the top are not really well informed about what's going on the ground. They have intermediate ranks that are simply enforcing things top-down. If we compare that to a mind that is not cultivated, there's a lot of analogies to be drawn, because an uncultivated mind is very centralized. It's essentially a little center of attention inside yourself that believes itself to be in charge. In other words, it feels like a me. There's a center to me in my mind that is in charge of the whole thing. It's in charge of the body, it's in charge of my actions, it's in charge of my thoughts, it's in charge of my emotions. And that being in charge creates a certain dynamic in which that supposed center is then imposing its will onto the rest of the system. And if somebody is creating trouble, like, if the heart feels pain, for example, or if the digestion is not good, that center is completely distressed by it, doesn't really want to know about it. It considers it a complete hassle. And very often it shuts down that information from coming up. It can't be bothered with that whole thing. If we then start to do the work of self-cultivation, we might become more of a democracy. In a democracy, there is an active participation of different parts of the system in the decision-making process. So the communication lines become much more open, and there is an interest at the top in understanding what is it that are the needs of the population. And there's also an interest in the population to actively convey their needs and be involved in decision-making. You could see that similarly in our mind-body once we start to cultivate. When we start to cultivate, we use the focus of our minds to start becoming more interested in reading the information on the ground. The ground in this case being the body. So we start to become actively engaged in trying to collect sensory perceptions from our body. And we start to notice that there was a lot that we didn't know about the body. There was a lot that was either a blind spot or a problem spot that we might have been shutting out actively or passively. And we start to notice that some spots are very problematic and they require a lot of negotiation. But we start to learn that even though it's a huge problem and it might be super uncomfortable, such as, for example, areas around the throat, the heart, or the pit of the stomach, your solar plexus, that you are still better off having an active discussion, an active negotiation with that part that is flaring up than ignoring it. That you're still better off collecting that information actively. You're better off knowing than not knowing. And so the power of the center, of the me, that believes itself to be in the center, starts to be questioned a little bit. So the me, or the I of the ego, starts to notice that it was not really as powerful as it thought, that there's a myriad of functions that are really just running on their own, and that the ego could not be running by itself because it lacks the bandwidth to do all these autonomic functions, such as beating the heart, secreting hormones, keeping your breathing going, and things of that kind. Digestion, for example, is also not a conscious thing, right? So it starts to become aware that there's an overwhelming amount of things happening on the societal level of the body that it is not in charge of, and it cannot manhandle or dictate from above. And so there's now a very active communication. Now, at some point, this reaches a tipping point. And that tipping point can rarely be explained with societal politics anymore. For that tipping point to be explained, we need to follow a different type of analogy, which I mentioned at the start, is more of a swarm type of intelligence. A school of fish or a murmuration of birds is better to describing what's happening here, because in a swarm, every individual holds the entire intelligence of the group, and the group is self-regulated, so that there is no real top-down to be spoken of, and every individual can be spoken of as both a transmitter and a receiver of open information back and forth all the time. There is no central decision making. Decisions are made by a single organism that is the swarm, as opposed to a collection of individuals. This comes very close to how enlightenment is described by masters who have achieved that level. They have mapped themselves out so thoroughly. The information channels are so open between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system that each part, whether it's your little left toe or your right hip or your heart or your thinking mind, are completely integrated and informing one another. There are no parts to be spoken of. There is no center to be spoken of. The illusion of a central self has completely disappeared to give way to a completely self-regulated organism that is not only entirely harmonious within itself, but that is entirely harmonious with its environment as well. And therefore, friction is reduced to a minimum. Energy is extremely high, but also the ability to perceive and to execute are exceptionally high, and they are orders of magnitude better than if they were trying to be managed in a political type of way, even if that political way was very advanced, such as in a democratic type of way. So I hope that analogy helps you understand that what we're trying to go for here is a level of intelligence that is a quantum leap or a quantum jump versus what we can achieve through even very smart means of the thinking mind. And I hope that the analogy that I drew to look at political systems versus, let's say, swarm intelligence is informing you in why this kind of work can deliver incredible results if followed through until completion. If you think that this is interesting and useful content, do like the video, subscribe to the channel, share your comments in the comment box, and share the video with anyone you think might benefit from the content. And as usual, I'll be back with more. Thanks for listening. Cheers.